Okay, here we go.
Welcome to the Assembly of Silence Radio Hour.
Okay, so I had said that I was going to take this episode and put it behind the Patreon paywall, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put it out there because that was the decision I made. And I don't really know why I decided that. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So this will be the conversation that preceded the previous episode. And you could kind of think of that as being somewhat like the format that we see so often in the movies where you're kind of going along a timeline, all of a sudden it gets interrupted and you're going back, except this is not all of a sudden because it's a separate episode. And also, it's a long format that's about ideas, and so it's sort of the opposite of a movie, which is a compressed format that's about emotional manipulation. So, there you go. That's the introduction. If you want to support the podcast, patreon.com/TaijiReality. Enjoy. Yes, okay, so what are we doing today?
Well, we had our conversation about free will, and we got into various topics, one of which being kind of the split or the differences between the physical and the spiritual self, and then we also brought in soul, which we didn't really go into too much, but I'd be interested to ask you about. And basically, I think you were going to use this as kind of like a follow-up to that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I listened to our conversation a couple times, and I just listened to it again. And I was thinking I was going to come to this with a certain list of questions, which I feel like actually listening to it again answered all of them. It's it's hard to pick those things up necessarily when you're having the conversation or even the first time you listen to it, but and so I guess I feel pretty clear on how you think about free will, though I still do want to get into those various parts. So there's we talked about the physical kind of being like the tool of the spiritual, or at least connected to the spiritual, and the spiritual sends it signals which it receives, and then it also picks up the body. The physical picks up things from the physical world and sends that back to the spiritual body. Is that kind of how you were describing it?
Well, the thing about it is that it's one thing to talk about it from a subjective point of view, where you're talking about an experiencer and what's happening to the experiencer. And I think that that's a good model if you're going to look at it that way. Because each of us knows that, okay, you wake up into this world, you have a body, it has a variety of sensations, internal and external, which you interpret in various ways through your cognitive and emotional mechanisms, and that there's an experiencer who is dramatically involved in that process. And it appears that the world that we're in consists of physical objects. So you can call that the physical space, and I think that that's perfectly fine. But I also think that it's quite possible, as I outline in that paper and as a number of other people, it's kind of this panpsychism type of way of looking at things, that when it really comes down to it, we're talking about networks of conscious beings. And so that there is no, like, quote-unquote physical space. There's just a domain of experience for each being that's in this kind of web of conscious beings. I mean, physics is a really problematic idea. Like, even within physics, there's some sort of a issue about where the stuff is, like what is the matter? Mm-hmm. On an atomic scale, you have incredible distances within the atom that are essentially, quote unquote, empty. And so, things are made up of mostly nothing is basically the way that even the physics community sees it to some extent. So what is this thing that does actually exist? I mean, the irony of the whole thing is, kind of as usual, the incredible inversion of conception. So we have had a tendency as a materialist culture to think of the thing that only truly exists as being the physical domain of objects, solidity, things that are real, and have kind of poo-pooed the idea that consciousness and spirit and all that stuff is real. But it may turn out that it's more realistic to think of the ground of being, the experience, as being the thing that we know is truly real, and that the arrangements that make up the physical world are essentially built from that, because there is a problem when it comes to putting your finger on what it is that makes the physical world physical.
So essentially, I think you would say that what is fundamentally true is experience itself, and that experience, that the physical world is a result of the world of experience.
I think so, right? But I don't think I could say that that's true. Do you know what I mean? Like, it makes sense to me, but I can't say that it's true. I don't know. I mean, the physical world is obviously real. So, the objects around us have a very vivid reality to them, and I don't want to in any way suggest that they don't. It's just that as we try to penetrate into what they are actually composed of, we start to get more and more, it gets more and more confusing, such that to the point where we have a picture of the quantum reality that in essence doesn't make any sense. I think, Richard Feynman said something like, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't. It's that basically what it's telling us, and whether or not it's actually true is another story, but the message that we're getting as we probe those ever smaller domains is that things are they just don't, it's not at all like what we seem to be perceiving in our day-to-day life.
Right. It seems very substantial to us in the experiential realm.
Yes.
So it seems like based from your articles that you wrote and I read, that basically you would say the world of the experiencer inputs, it receives what's going on in the external, in quotes, world, and then it is able to send energy into that external world with the goal of initiating some change which it desires. And that energy is what makes up the physical world. Like all existing physical things are a result of all previous wishings of things to be a certain way.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to summarize it. I'd say that what we're getting are messages of what's going on. We're not really getting what's going on. We're getting messages. We have sensory apparatus that operates within some bandwidth, and the messages are extremely complex, and quite often we miss a good portion of them, and so we're not really getting a picture of what's going on. We're getting messages about what's going on. It's a fine distinction, but basically, yeah, I completely agree with that. And again, I'd say it makes sense to me, but I wouldn't say that it's true. I don't know how to actually prove it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's provable, but it makes a lot of sense to me. An incredible number of things fall into place when you start to look at things in those terms. And it's not like this is a new way of looking at things. I think there's a long tradition of this kind of, you might say, spiritually oriented ontology. And it's not just in the East or the West. Both, there are traditions on all sides, you might say, that have this notion of consciousness as being fundamental. And, even within the scientific world, I think Max Planck basically said exactly the same thing, that behind
and even
all
Sam
of this,
Harris essentially.
Yeah,
Sam Harris basically says it's the only reason that anything matters. It's like, okay, well, it sounds like you're saying it's primary then.
I know, and it's kind of bizarre that he doesn't
Yeah.
see free will as being an agent here. It's just that
Yeah.
that
He just
seems to
thinks
me
that
to be.
consciousness has no impact. It's just the flowing of what some separate world, which actually is doing all the, deciding, is making it feel like it's like just floating on an ocean. It has no control over what's happening, yet it just seems like it's the only thing that actually is. So why are we giving this imaginary physical world priority over it?
Well, I don't think that saying that the physical world is imaginary is correct, because the network between conscious nodes is real. So the conscious nodes are convinced of their separateness, and they are operating within their own domain. It takes an awful lot to convince a consciousness that it's not separate. And even if you do convince it of that fact, it's very difficult for it to live as if that were the case.
Yeah, I mean,
Basically,
it doesn't feel that way,
no, it
no
doesn't
matter
feel
what
that
it
way at all. So
thinks.
the actual experience is that we are separate nodes of consciousness. And you can talk as much as you want about how we're all one, but and it's like, maybe that's true on some level, but come on. I mean, really, we are all individuated senses of being. That's what it really. That's what it feels like. That's what the experience of existence is. In some sense, it couldn't be any other way, because if we were all one, then we'd be undifferentiated. And without differentiation, there would be nothing to experience. So it kind of has to be this way. And yeah, I think that the Harris idea, it's almost like he's just really disappointed that he can't get the outcomes that he wants. And so he's just trashing the whole idea that we have any influence on the frame at all. I think, the problem is that, yeah, we actually do have an influence on what occurs within, let's call it the physical domain, just to make it simple. The problem is that it doesn't tend to work out as we intend, but intent is an entirely different thing than free will.
Yep.
Right? Free will is the capacity to choose. It's the idea that we can operate as an independent agent. Now, whether we're an agent of chaos or an agent of order or some mix, or if we have any capacity to follow through and see things to the end in the way that we had originally intended them, that's a completely different question. And it's an interesting question, but I don't think it's related to free will, and I don't think it's worth being disappointed if you feel that things don't work out the way you want them to. I love the quote that says, if you want to hear God laugh, tell him your plans. Because it's an outrageously complex world. Existence is not. It may be made of somewhat simple components, but it's not a simple thing to exist. It's a simplex situation, I guess, to talk about it in terms of the way Ken Wheeler talks about it. But that doesn't mean that it's something that can be mastered. We are humble and very limited in our power to really influence things.
Yeah, it's like we're an individual node of. I mean, this is just a way of thinking about it. An individual node of basically God experiencing the universe, and I think people realize that type of thing, and they get kind of a big head about it. But when you think about it, you're about as low as the low, the lowest. I mean, you're as insignificant as anything else, because everything else is God playing a role as well, and so there's nothing really special about you.
Well, I guess that's also an arguable point, and I've done a lot of thinking about that, and I'm not sure exactly where I come down on it, but I do think that there are levels that go way lower, that on some level we're given a facility that not all nodes of consciousness have. So that reflexive ability to be able to consider what one is doing, it seems as if that's not something that all conscious nodes are capable of doing.
Do you think that element is required for free will?
That's a great question. I think so. I mean, how could you make a decision other than the one that you were kind of programmed to make if you don't have free will? So
Well,
you'd
it
have
seems
to
like
be
the
able.
choice could still be being made. I mean, a fish simply has a system which gives it less information, and the
Right.
only information that it has is basically that it wants to eat that worm on the hook. But it seems like it still could be making a free will choice, like whatever free will is, that could be still existing there. It just doesn't have any information, and so its choice is extremely predictable. And for a human, it's just much more complex.
A fish is a relatively high-level organism. They are pretty complex. They've got a lot of different parts. They're able to sense and respond in many, many different ways. So I think that, maybe when we start talking about bacteria or something like that, or worms, or maybe if we're going to go the panpsychism route to talk about atoms, it seems like atoms, they basically respond the way they respond. Is there a free choice within an atom? I don't know. I mean, that to some extent might account for the random distribution of things. Sometimes there's like a percentage of times that things will behave in one
Yeah.
way, and so there's a lot of variation. But in essence, it seems that the atom has a very circumscribed set of behaviors, and you might say that it's same with molecules.
Yeah, an electron might, act very predictably, the same in all the other electrons around it, but there's the chance, like a 1 in 500 billion trillion chance, that it's going to show up on Mars instead of within this wire that you had it rolling around in. So it is almost certainly going to do something. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, like, we rely on there being predictable behavior in order to develop technology. So the fact that the electrons are behaving far and above way more reliably than they don't, it says something about the nature of an electron, if such a thing does actually exist. But,
Yeah.
You could say that inherent within the conscious potential is this reflexive property that can be exercised to varying degrees. I mean, we see that within humanity, which has this, self-consciousness. It's one of the confusing aspects of the words that I think is really important to delineate. Like, you have consciousness, and then you have conscious of, right? So, we really should have a bunch of different terms, I think. But consciousness, I think of as being the capacity to sense and respond through an agent of an experiencer. So a being that experiences is basically a node of consciousness. And then self-consciousness is the awareness of what one is doing, of what one is thinking. And so humans obviously have that potential, but we see that within our kind, there's a huge range of the degree to which people are self-conscious. And sometimes self-consciousness turns out to be a pathology, where people are immobilized because they're so aware of what they're doing. So there's a way in which self-consciousness can also be an impediment and get in the way of dealing with the physical frame, you could say.
So do you think that the free will exists all the way up from the electron to the human, and it's just basically a function of, how likely it is that it's going to do something unpredictable? Or do you think that when we add that ability to reflect, that's where free will comes into play?
I would say that free will is inherent potential within consciousness, but that depending on the relationship, you could say it's like the context. Basically, a node of consciousness is within a context of its environment. And so we have very complex environments to navigate. And on a certain level, when you get down to the atomic level, the environment is perhaps a bit simpler. In other words, an atom's environment is a set of, usually I think it's 92 other possible elements that it might come in contact with, and even then it's typically a far smaller number of elements that it will typically come into contact with. So even though we've been able to synthesize whatever, I can't remember what the number is, 120 some odd different elements, the ones that actually exist, naturally, I believe it's something like the 92, and then the ones that are prevalent are just a handful, really. So in a certain sense, atoms are dealing with an environment that consists of a handful of possibilities. So
Yeah.
that's their reality. We have far more complicated sets of environmental issues to navigate. And so we have to have a consciousness that's capable, in order to maintain our existence, of navigating these complex environments. So I think a lot of it is circumstantial. But I do believe that, that potential exists, and that to some extent it's a reflection of the type of network that's being managed, because I think of consciousness as being, in essence, something that arises as a result of a network, and that there's kind of a field coherency within a network that forms a central node, and that central node is then sort of the meta-consciousness for the arrangement of the consciousness within it, all the various conscious elements within it. Because if we're going to really say that everything is built from consciousness, then every node within the network is a conscious being. And the thing that defines an entity is that it's an arrangement, a network that has a central organizing node, that there's field coherency between the various entities in the network, and that there is a center point around which they all organize themselves. Yeah. If that's the case, then the characteristics of that central nodal consciousness is going to depend a lot on the arrangement of the network of the subsidiary entities.
So it sounds like basically you're saying it exists all the way down, but as the system gets more complex, more information about what's going on in the environment gets more diverse and accurate, that it becomes more unpredictable what the being or node is going to actually end up doing. And so it's going to seem like, as you get from the level of electrons up to humans, that humans are much more free than electron, though maybe on a fundamental level it's not really different. It's just a matter of information.
Free to choose, perhaps, but free in some sort of existential way, I doubt it. I also think that it's not necessarily more accurate. I think probably less accurate, because the more complex a system is and the more complex an environment is, there's so many different points along the way that where the chain can be broken, and the correspondence between a signal being sent and received can be confused.
Well, let's take the example of the fish and the human. So we would say the fish is lower than what the human is on whatever scale we're using here, but the fish is going to not see that the worm is on a hook and a human is. That seems like we're moving towards accuracy as we get more complex.
Well, I don't think so. I think just because we can identify on one level of domain what it is that's happening doesn't mean that now that, we're sort of existing on another level of domain that we have any better sense of what's really going on. So we can comment on the world of the fish and say, well, man, if you could only figure out that hook. I always think about the deer too. It's like, how many times does your type have to get hit by a car before you realize that when the lights are coming, like just look both ways before you cross, but they don't, So my sense is that as consciousness develops in its understanding of things and new vistas are opened up, it finds itself in a new world. And that quite often the larger the world, because remember, we're all humble, right? The larger the world that we start to perceive, the less we know what's going on. So in a certain sense, you could say, as knowledge increases, so does ignorance.
So is it just relative ignorance in that you're no longer aware of a different world, which was ultimately not any more true than the world that you are kind of in now? Or are you saying that as you get less complicated and know less, you're actually closer to the truth of the way things are?
Well, of course, the way things are, there's two ways of looking at that. One of them is the subjective sense of what it means to be a particular being. So the way things are...
And that's all I mean.
So it's the subjective way things are for a fish, right, is perhaps better known to it than the subjective way of being for a human being at this point, because we know so much that we don't know. And as we kind of, you could say that on some level, civilization is proof that as we increase our understanding, we ruin the world.
Well, our current civilization, I would agree with that, but I don't think necessarily civilization has to be so ruinous.
Well, let's put it this way. It seems that, our current civilization is a aggregate of all previous civilizations, and the previous civilizations really aren't here anymore to weigh in. So they failed on some level.
Well,
right?
Well, let's say that they failed. There was supposedly, like, for example, a cataclysm which happened 11,800 years ago, which basically wiped out a fairly advanced civilization. Now, that civilization could have turned out much better and more in tune with living on the earth than our current civilization.
No, that's true.
And it's not really, I mean, you can say it's a failure, but if the entire North American ice caps melted and covered the entire continent with water, I mean, basically a worldwide flood followed by an immediate ice age. I mean, what civilization could really survive that? So it's not, I don't feel like it's really a judgment of that civilization to say that they were destroyed.
Right. I think you're right about that. And that's a good point. We would hope that any robust way of understanding the world would be something that could survive whatever calamities come our way, but obviously that's not the case. So I think that the catastrophist aspect of this is definitely a really good point and something that I wasn't thinking about. But okay, so let's forget about the past civilizations that might have done it a lot better. Let's just say that the one that we're presently involved in is in essence a global civilization. There's a lot of disagreement within it, but nevertheless, we are all utilizing technology and the raw materials of the world to try to bring about our outcomes, where we have intentions and we're taking actions based upon our free will in the hopes that it might produce a better world. But we're finding that, well, the world turns out to be far more complex and difficult to manage than we might have thought. We probably should have known better. I'm not sure whether anyone really believed it as that story was being promulgated, but nevertheless, that has been the story. That's sort of the narrative that keeps us going. And so the question is, well, could it have been different? And is this basically a byproduct of the pursuit of knowledge? The biblical story of the eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that this is the fundamental fall from grace.
Well, but I mean, in that story, it's implied that there are beings who exist, and it's not just God, who do have that knowledge and are living in a way which is not destructive in the way that humanity has become. So is knowledge a problem, or is knowledge for humans a problem?
It's the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. What does that mean?
I mean, wouldn't you say an angel has that knowledge?
An angel may not care about whether something occurs on the basis. Okay, so again, good and evil have a subjective and a quote-unquote objective meaning. So from the subjective point of view, good is something that is good for you. Evil is something that is not good for you. I've heard it said that the original terms in Hebrew that were translated as good and evil really meant something more along the lines of advantageous or disadvantageous. So it's the knowledge of what one might do in order to gain advantage, so that whatever you think individually is good is you get to enjoy the goods of the world, you could say.
Well, all beings with that knowledge tend towards corruption, or is that specific to humans?
Well, if you think of it in kind of a evolutionary biology sense, you could say that if one species takes everything that's good for itself and avoids all of the evils for itself, what is the impact on the environment?
Well, it's destroyed, and then that thing is destroyed.
Well, you could say that a ecosystem relies upon there being niches that are occupied and not overly exploited. So, for example, like the fish that bites on the hook, if it had the knowledge of good and evil, it could tell the difference between the hook and the worm, right? And it would, and some of them do, you know. So if you're a fisherman, you know that fish actually do understand this to some extent. You really got to trick them into it. But basically, a lot of creatures have a limited ability to really navigate what they're going to do in order to make life better for themselves.
Right. So humans have an understanding of the past and future to a greater degree than most other animals, and so it's able to see how things have worked and how things could work, and so that they're going to manipulate their environment they live in to the best advantage of for themselves and people they care about.
Right.
And I think you're saying that knowledge will eventually lead to it basically destroying the ecosystem in itself, because it's not going to be able to choose in a way that isn't more, I don't know, holistic. But I think that the idea that you're describing, you can have a more holistic understanding and know that despite it seeming like it's to your advantage to manipulate everything to your advantage, it's not actually to your advantage to do that, because you're going to destroy the environment. And so you will reach a level of balance there. And yet humans have definitely not done that, but it seems like having the knowledge of good and evil can contain that holistic perspective and therefore balance.
But only
itself.
if that knowledge of good and evil is something that goes beyond the experiencer.
Well, not necessarily, because you can understand that the environment needs to exist in order for you to live. So you can maintain the pure selfishness of the individual being wanting to survive, and understand that you also need to, not be totally domineering and, just destroying everything for your advantage.
But when push comes to shove, there are points where, in order for the environment to be maintained, self-sacrifice has to go to some incredible extremes. I mean, this notion of sacrifice is something that was so built into the original conception of spirituality. It's almost completely ignored nowadays, along with humility. It's kind of bizarre that we've developed these spiritual concepts that basically have eliminated the core of the spiritual teachings. But, in order for the order to be preserved, there are times where the sacrifice goes to the point of the ultimate sacrifice. And that's an awful lot to ask of anyone.
Is it, though? I mean, if you think that you exist beyond this life, like you're not just your body, then whatever you're sacrificing for is going to be your environment. It's going to continue to be your environment.
That's right.
So it's not really sacrificial. It's just wise.
Exactly. I completely agree. But I'm saying it's a lot to ask because we feel as if this existence is the only thing going. It's the same reason why the idea of a universal soul may be appealing and we can understand it to some extent, but the experience that we're having is as if this were the only life. It's built into the cake. So it's really difficult and not trivial to get beyond that. I mean,
But it is possible, wouldn't you agree?
I
it's
do
possible?
think it's possible.
I mean, I feel like I would make decisions. I believe that I am not my body, and that what happens to this world matters to me after I'm dead.
Right.
And therefore, it's very easy for me to make decisions which seem so self-sacrificial to other people. But that, from my perspective, it is completely selfish.
Again, it's going to depend an awful lot on the environmental circumstances. And on some level, we don't really know how we're going to behave until we're confronted with the situations that put us to the test. So
that's true.
I think one of the things that Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about, who is a Russian who was in the gulags in the Soviet era, is that it was just amazing the way that people would respond to the conditions that they found themselves in, which were quite often some of the worst that you could imagine. And that some people would, in some ways, even unexpectedly rise to the highest level of their humanity, and others would descend to the furthest depths.
Hmm.
And a lot of it had to do with the degree to which they were able to control themselves and to see the goodness in not getting what you want. This, I think, is beautifully represented in the trigrams. I don't know if we've discussed the trigrams much. I have a terrible memory. So,
Okay, so just before we go into the trigrams, I just want to make sure we have context about where we are so that we don't forget and get lost. So basically, what is your sense of what the context is for this branch of the conversation?
I think that what we're struggling with is a sense of what the potential is given the arrangement that we're in. So we're clearly conscious beings in a universe that appears to be more complex than we can really manage. So we are in the context of a civilization endeavor to control nature as much as possible. And what appears to be happening is that despite our best efforts, things keep slipping past our controls. And we end up with things that are either out of control or we end up with a system that's oppressive and that no one would want to live under.
And do you think this is specific to the human situation, or that's specific to any being that has the knowledge of good and evil?
Well, I think it's probably difficult to live under any circumstance. Any living being is typically going to have pretty much a similar type of prospect. There are going to be long stretches of time that are difficult, fraught with difficulty. And there will be little glimpses of light here and there punctuating that. My sense is that even in our nearest relatives, like the primates, that life it has its joys, but there are oppressive, hierarchical elements to the social groupings, and it can be very brutal at times, and one can end up in really difficult situations that are not fun to deal with at all.
But there's definitely situations which are much worse more of the time, and situations which are much better most of the time. So there's definitely a spectrum here. And so let's say out beyond human, to other species on different planets who have the knowledge of good and evil, who don't necessarily have the same difficulty that we have with it, and therefore are able to balance it.
Well, but we can't speak to that. We can only speculate on that. I know that there's some people who say that they're in contact with, the visitors, but
Well, okay. So if we need to remove that, I don't feel like it's necessary. I mean, we could just talk about with humans. On a human scale, there's definitely people who are doing better most of the time, and the people who are doing pretty bad most of the time. And so there's already that scale. Now, if aliens exist, then obviously that extends up into that, probably well beyond the top human threshold, I would guess. But
yeah, I don't know.
it seems like there definitely is a scale and a way to improve your situation. So it's not true that everything's just blah and struggle and exactly the same no matter what being you are.
And I think that, those of us who are still engaged in life are continually trying to figure out, well, am I adopting the best strategy to deal with the circumstance that I'm in?
And it's working. I mean, from my perspective, it works. Like, things have definitely got better for me as I'm doing that.
There's no doubt that we have an influence and that influence can significantly change the experience that we're having. But I also think that there's no necessary connection between intention and outcome, and that the law of unintended consequences tends to play a role in just about everything that we do. So we have to remember, I think that's the humility in the whole thing, the idea that somehow or another we're going to come up with a strategy that's going to work under any given circumstance so that we are all the masters of our destiny. I think that's really not the way it works.
Well, that wouldn't be any fun.
You have to have a degree of randomness in every game, right? If we were all completely according to some rule book, and if you just simply follow the rules, it will lead to a particular destination, that would be a pretty boring game, right? So there is definitely this element of chance, and And there's always this huge realm of the unknown that also comes into play because, we're doing our best to understand things as we go along and to play our hand accordingly. But there's an awful lot that we don't understand about the story. And there's always another frame. There's always another larger picture. There's always some detail, too, which reminds me of something that I wanted to say earlier, and I don't even know if it's related, but that because I remembered, I want to just say it briefly, because we were talking about the choice of the particles, the atoms, the molecules, and whether or not they could decide to behave differently. There's a couple of really interesting passages in some of the ancient scriptures that say things like one of the things that I remember in a Taoist phrase is there's the day of reckoning where all of a sudden the configuration of the stars changes. So the potentiality for there being a major restructuring, the kind of the catastrophist model that you were alluding to earlier, where all of a sudden everything is completely different and whatever civilization was trying to do is just completely interrupted, if not destroyed. I think of that potential as happening on a lot of different scales. So on some level, the largest arrangement of things is determined by the relationship within the smallest things. So if all of a sudden the basic behavior of the particles changed even a little bit, you could imagine that the whole freaking universe would change. So I think on some level that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about the mind of God, that if everything in the universe is experiencing and there is a kind of field coherency to the entire universe, and there's a central node, which is the root experiencer of things, if the aggregate of all of that, because in our bodies, we are the root experiencer for all the network of the various cells and, different conscious entities that make up the body. And we have a distinct message about how things are going on. When you feel like shit, you feel like shit. All the cells in the body feel like shit, and then you feel like shit, and then you're going to make an adjustment. You're going to do something differently if you're still really interested in being in the game. And I think that there's a good chance, I'm not saying this is true, I'm saying this is what makes sense to me. There's a good chance that that's basically the same story with God, that God is the one who is getting all of the messages from all of the other experiencing beings. And if the whole thing feels sick or ill, that a major adjustment will be made and the whole story will change.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see even the Earth as a node in itself just getting sick with the situation.
Exactly.
But you could go to a galactic scale, you could go to a universal scale, or if you want to go to the ultimate, I don't know, ideal or form. I don't know if it actually is an absolute thing or if it's just a pattern that repeats fractally throughout the universe. But God, basically, the root stack, put in, I guess, computer terms of everything, the thing that exists in every single frame, but every frame is actually distinct, yet this thing is, common to all.
And so you could say that is the universal soul, right? And that each individual node is an individual soul, right? And that the message from the universal soul to the individual soul is the spirit.
Okay, so good. We're back to spirit. I like that. Okay, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know that's kind of where we were talking about going before, and I wanted to make sure we look at it a little bit. But I have a question for you. So you were talking about how we could think of the Earth now as being a node which in and of itself may be kind of ill, let's say. So one of the things that I've wondered about is, well, if that's the case, is that a symptom of a larger phenomena happening in the universe and we're just suffering because of that? Or are we responsible for that having occurred, and as a consequence, there's now the potential for that to spread on some level? You know what I'm saying? Like, it's sort of a question of ideology.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Is the Earth sick? Is the Earth sick, and therefore we're sick, and the Earth is sick is because of the environment it exists in? It's just the situation at the moment. or is there something wrong with humanity and ultimately it's our fault? The Earth's fine, and if we get annoying enough, the Earth's just going to shrug us off, and then everything will be fine again.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would lean more towards the latter, but I don't think it's necessarily something wrong with humanity, at least in our original form. Of course, this gets into a much bigger topic, and I don't think we should go into it. But I would just say I think we were tampered with at some point, and ever since then we have been in this non-adapted state, which is basically sort of like a virus, or we have a virus, and therefore we're acting like a virus to our host planet. So, I mean, that's the situation I see humanity in. I don't think there's anything wrong with the planet.
So how would we distinguish between? I mean, you could say that the source of that virus is the understanding that we developed of the natural world.
I don't think that that's true. I think that the understanding is not the problem. I think it's like there's something missing. There's like we had something removed, like we had a channel on our radio where we were connected to something which gave us a lot of meaning, and that channel was turned way down, and most people don't hear it. The human body at the moment is incapable of broadcasting that back to the spirit, and so essentially we just go around seeking this to fill this hole with things like sex and drugs and food and yeah, that's essentially why we're destructive. We just are not in tune with something which is important.
Well, let's talk briefly about the trigrams, because I think that it's just a really beautiful way of being able to talk about these things. Unfortunately, it's talking about a visual set of symbols on a podcast, so there's an awkwardness to that. But I'll put in a link in the description. Places where you can take a look at what we're talking about here. But basically, there are two arrangements of the trigrams. The trigrams are three lines, either solid or broken. Together, two trigrams make up a hexagram, which is what you're talking about when you talk about the I Ching. But prior to the I Ching, there were these two arrangements. One is called prenatal, and the other one's called postnatal. And in the prenatal arrangement, you have balance of all the trigrams. Each trigram is balanced by its opposite. So if you have three solid lines, then across from it is three broken lines. And if you have one solid and two broken above, then across from it is one broken and two solid above. The postnatal is not arranged like that at all. It seems like kind of a jumble, and until you decode it, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. I mean, until you decode the prenatal, it doesn't make much sense, even though it is balanced. You can see that it's balanced. Now, at the top of the trigram is the focal point. There's a Chinese phrase that says the emperor always faces south. So in the northern hemisphere, if you want to see the light, if you want to follow the progression of the sun, you're facing south, right? And so at the top of the trigram, of the arrangement of the trigrams is, you could say, the goal. It's where the attention is placed. So in the prenatal, heaven is the goal. It's at the top. And in the postnatal, fire is at the top. Now, fire represents, and I could tell you why, but let's not bother with that. I'm just going to say fire represents desire. That's pretty obvious, right? But literally, it represents desire, because a trigram is an arrangement of the mind in time. So the top and bottom lines are solid. The middle line is broken. And desire is basically about losing the present because you have an idea from the past, an object that's held in the mind that you want to realize again in the future. So desire is about chasing after an object that you have in your mind to try to get it again or get it for the first time, whatever. It's desire.
And that leads to behavior which acts like fire, which is, we think of as destructive, although it's not purely destructive. It's the reason the air works in our lungs is essentially because of the fire element.
Right. But of course, an excess of burning will produce a lot of carbon dioxide, right? So
basically the spiritual being is putting out a lot of energy and therefore influencing change very quickly. Fire is very quick.
Yes. So fire is an agent of change. Yes. It's a quick burn. The more desire there is, the more everything gets burned through, you could say. So it's the opposite of sacrifice. It's although it is a kind of sacrifice, right? You have the sacrificial fire.
But you're generally
Right.
sacrificing something other than
So-
yourself.
Well, what you're sacrificing is the future. So if you're operating on the basis of your desires and just feeding your wants all the time, what you're doing is you're sacrificing the future.
So that the future can be a certain way.
Because you're changing the present. So if you want to preserve something, you can't burn it.
But if it's already been here and already left, you already failed in the preservation, then what else do you have to do than to try and
Right.
retain it, regain it?
Well, that's why a lot of people are just like, fuck it, let's just have sex and do drugs.
But I mean, it is sensible from a certain perspective. I mean, a child may have been raised a certain way and it was a good situation, and then both of their parents died. And, there's a sense of, oh, that's not a good example because they can't really fix that situation. But let's say they break their arm. It's not a bad thing to want to regain.
Well, I mean, you could fix that situation in a spiritual way. Right. I mean, there's the potential, I think, to fix any situation, but I think you're right. That indicates, it suggests the situation is going to be far more difficult to put together and make right.
Well, I guess I'm just saying it's not necessarily bad to try and regain lost states of goodness.
Well, I think it might be a mistake to try to regain a lost state of physical goodness, but I think it's probably the only...
Well, broken arm, it's good to try and repair your arm.
Well, yeah, but I think if you're talking about if you're talking about a physical frame that has been ruined, right, on some level, like it's not working the way there's no way of it ever being the same thing that it was before, right? So if you're talking about an ecosystem, like I think that there is a very, very limited chance that we're going to be able to restore the natural world to what it was before all of this interruption came. So all this effort to like get rid of invasive species and stuff like that, it's like that just seems like an uphill battle that will not really go anywhere. It's going to be a different configuration.
Yeah, that documentary you pointed me towards was basically saying that whole idea of reaching some balanced state is not actually real. It's just constantly changing. It's always going to be a different situation.
Now, you have to wonder whether the studies that they did at that time, and what we're referring to is the third section of Adam Curtis's All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which is an incredible documentary. I think you have to watch it like 10 or 20 times before you can really grasp exactly what's going on there. And even, I've watched it many times and I listen to it. I don't even watch it anymore. I'll just listen to it while I'm working sometimes. And the things that come out of it each time, the number of connections, it's just incredible. And I don't necessarily agree with the whole point of view that's put forward there, but you got to wonder, like, would the experiments, let's say that you could do an experiment before the Garden of Eden issue, right? Before the fall and before we ate the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, would those experiments have had the same outcome? In other words, is the disruption to nature so profound and that it predates industrialization? I mean, at the time that those experiments were being done in the 70s, we already had significant encroachment on the natural world. And so like the balance between the wolves and the antelope or whatever it was that they were observing in that park, that was way more dynamic than they had anticipated. You got to wonder if it weren't for the disruption of the urban centers and what have you, would it perhaps be less dramatic, the kinds of fluctuations that we saw? So I'm not going to say that that's necessarily an inherent aspect of nature, although it does seem that on some basic level, the law of thermodynamics always suggests that the material configuration of the physical domain is converting from one state to another, and that energy is being recycled through that, but it doesn't have the opportunity to really continually maintain itself.
Right. At least a specific node of energy is if it is turned into a new state, like if you burn someone's body, that energy is never going to return to the body that it was.
Exactly. And so in essence, you could say that life is a metabolic process on planet Earth that's converting and transforming the material of the Earth. There are some ancient cosmological stories. I think some of the Native Americans and South Americans have stories that are basically like, well, the universe was this big being and it died, and then all of these things started living off of the body of the dead universe. Like, so there's that kind of image of what's going on. And maybe that is sort of what's going on,
Well, I feel like that fits into what I was describing earlier. It's like I said, humanity seems to have lost connection to something. And
yeah. So
if you were to lose that connection, it would seem like it had died, but that doesn't necessarily mean it died. And yeah, I would agree, you would then have to become basically vampiric, but it doesn't mean we can't regain that connection. And in that case, the knowledge of good and evil wouldn't be a bad thing, and we wouldn't be destructive with it. Really, the problem is the lost connection.
It depends on whether or not the frame is the individual soul, the psychic ego that's involved in the drama of the body, or if it's a frame of the universal soul of all of existence. That's kind of represented in like an Aquarian sensibility in those
but regaining that connection makes those two things not different. Do you know what I mean?
Well, there is a distinction, and you can say yes, that when you consider things within the frame of the universal soul, those distinctions disappear. But to some extent, that's ignoring reality, because the fact of the matter is that most beings will continue to operate as if the individual being were the thing that mattered. So we're dealing with you could say, egocentric set of entities which make up the ego of the universe, can we say? I don't know.
Yeah, but I think that's true, but I think if you have that connection, like in the same way that I can know that it's maybe advantageous for me to sacrifice myself because I know I'll continue to exist in whatever environment my effects had, it still seems like if you have that connection, your choices can primarily come from that more global perspective of what I do to someone else, I'm doing to myself.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's represented in the trigram arrangements. The postnatal is a representation of the drama that happens within the ego-oriented, individuated self mind. And then the prenatal is a representation of the potential that occurs with the connection to the capital S self, the where one is free from the drama of the individuated self and sees things from that broader perspective of the inclusiveness of all things.
But is there the prenatal postnatal seems to kind of imply that the prenatal comes first, but it seems like there can be a prenatal-ish type phase, which is postnatal. You know what I mean? It's like returning to that connection, but with the lessons that have been learned.
Well, I think that actually the way to think of it is that the prenatal is the unembodied. So the natal is the thing which is born into this world, right? And so the thing that is an entity within the world is in an environment, and the environment has demands that are placed upon it in order for it to continue to survive. And that's why the drama of the individuated self exists. The conception of the prenatal is that the unmanifest being, which exists within all things, is the root of existence, is the king of kings, is the essence of spirit that makes life worthwhile and really good. And so the recognition of that is what allows one to perform sacrifice and not simply try to get whatever one can to feed the physical body, which is inherently temporal and fleeting. I think that the prenatal is it's not like a sequential thing, and actually this I think relates very nicely to what you just said about the body of God not being dead, right? Like I didn't say that very well. That the idea that we are in a universe where God is dead is to some extent really just an artifact of the perspective, and so it's the recognition of the unity of experience that brings God to life, you could say, because we're in a physical frame.
Yeah.
And so the whether or not God shows up here has to do with whether or not the beings recognize the existence of God.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
And that's basically what I'm describing. I'm basically, when the prenatal, then there's the postnatal, and then I guess the phase that I'm describing is the combination of the two. I mean, you still have the physical world and the
Yes.
being who exists in the physical world, but more
Yes.
dominant, or at least balanced, is the understanding of the fact that this is all temporary and there's something more primary and real than
Yeah.
your immediate concerns.
And the physical frame itself.
Yeah.
The Taoists have a wonderful term for what you're talking about there. They call it the yin convergence, which is it's kind of akin to saying before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Yeah.
So the yin convergence is basically like, okay, having gained some depth of understanding about the world beyond, about the prenatal, about the spirit and the source of conscious essence, how do we return to ordinary life and do the work of the spirit, you could say? And I think that's really kind of the big question. I think that is the spiritual question. If we believe that this is a living, conscious universe, and that our actions are significant, and that free will is a gift given to us, then what is the best use of that will? How do we make a future that's worth living for all of the living beings in existence? What is that? I mean, that's kind of the Buddhist thing. It's like the Bodhisattva comes to live in this world to free all beings from unnecessary suffering, let's say. Right? Because that is really the byproduct of the actions that we take based upon our free will. The choices that are made accumulate into the reality that beings have to live in.
But if we have that connection to the prenatal, then we won't cause all the problems that humanity is currently causing. I mean, of course, like you just said, there will still be some problems. You're not going to solve suffering altogether, but it's definitely not going to be what we have today.
Well, there's some interesting passages about this. There's a text called Understanding Reality by Cheng Po Chuan that's very difficult to understand, but it's really, really worth the effort. And one of the things that's discussed is as you gain understanding, the risk of making a false step becomes ever greater. And so I should look up the passage and try to find it, because it's an amazing passage. And I think it's very true that you can become very proud of yourself when you start to realize things. you know? And so it is a slippery slope of falling back into, in some senses, an even worse ego-oriented state of being. I think that's something that's reflected in the Hindu concept of sattva, the gunas, the material modes of nature. You have rajas, the desire. You have tamas, the ignorance. And that's what people are typically stewing in. And then you have sattva, which is this, I realize my ignorance, I realize my desire, I'm going to pursue enlightenment, And you get very proud and excited of yourself because, now you're enlightened and you have all these wonderful ideas. It's like...
So what's the lesson there, though? Should we not go on that ride then? Like, would you just say we should stay back at some previous state?
Well, I don't think it's that binary. I think what it involves is absolute diligence on what is really going on within your consciousness.
But if it's continuing to get more complicated and more risky, the more that you learn, and I think you are someone like me who's going to continue to learn, you're basically guaranteeing that it's going to fail. And the farther along you get, the worse that failure is going to be. So is it really worth it?
Here's where we get into, I think, the primary activity, whether we like it or not. So the tendency is to want to feel that we can apply deepening understanding to some kind of a design, and that we will be able to engineer our way into the future. But the technique that's used in order to move from the individuated, postnatal, desire-ridden state of being to connection with the prenatal spiritual mode of being is one of thought negation. The process is literally letting go of the designs that we have for how to manage the future.
Well, at least the designs that come in the form of thinking. I feel like those designs, from my experience, those designs are not primarily thought.
Well, I would say that design is always a thought, because, you have the design, then you have the implementation. So, maybe it's just a terminology thing. But I would say, yeah, within the realm of thought, we're talking about the realm of thought. There's obviously things that need to be done, carry wood, chop water. And there's a lot of tasks like that, right? So all of the things that need to be done in that way, beautiful. But the idea that we're going to be able to create a roadmap, and that it's going to have certain specifications, and that we're going to basically figure out a plan and make it happen. I think that those are always ill-fated.
Well, it seems like you're talking about creation itself. I mean, the chopping wood, carrying water is kind of just maintaining the status quo, and then starting on some big grand project of creating like a new form of free energy or something like that would be some extreme.
Well, in a thermodynamic universe,
huge project, which you're going to.
In a thermodynamic universe, the status quo is never maintained. It doesn't matter how much they try to hold on to it; it's always going to slip away.
Well, I'm talking about scale here, though. So the person who's carrying wood chopping water, carrying that person who's doing that is pretty much not changing much. They're not trying to change the world, the way the world is. But someone who's embarking on this big grand project of creation, of bringing something new into the world, it's much different than that. And yeah, there's lots of unforeseen consequences, and there may be some bad things that come out of it. And depending on how much they really want to do here, it could turn out to be really bad. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this act of creation, not this act, but the act of creation, is inherently going to turn out badly.
Well, I think maybe we have a disagreement about that, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's worth trying to probe this. When you're chopping wood and carrying water, you're not just maintaining the status quo. You're doing things that are necessary. Like if you don't chop the wood, then you're not going to have the fuel necessary to make it through the winter, right? And you have to carry the wood too, by the way.
Then the status quo is that you're alive.
What's that?
The status quo is that you're alive, and so able to maintain that, you have to chop the wood, carry the water.
But from a prenatal point of view, there is no status quo, and you're not going to be alive for long at all. So what you're maintaining is something that's like a flickering flame, on a short candle.
Sure, but that's still maintained, despite the fact that it's going to go out. It's still maintained, and I'm using this as in reference to the other one where someone's trying to change the world, the entire world. And yes, that's temporary as well. But when we're comparing the two examples, there's definitely a distinction. There's a scale.
Well, what I would say is that the status quo is the result of the unforeseen byproducts of the plan that is now turned into an ordeal. And that's hubris. That hubris is you have an idea about how things should be. And so you make your best efforts.
There's a different amount of hubris in the situation where the chopping wood and carrying water, as opposed to the big plan to make a free energy.
Well, the question is like, how much hubris is okay? Let's say like hubris, I'm going to use a metaphor. Let's say you have a glass of champagne and a glass of shit. It's like, okay, well, how much shit is okay to put in the champagne and it's still drinkable? You know?
Well, the point at which you're going to get sick or taste it, I suppose.
So that's not much. We don't have room for a hell of a lot of hubris in that glass.
But hey, who knows? Wait, we don't know that hubris is as bad as shit.
That's definitely the question. That's what we got to zero in on. It's like, how bad is hubris and what actually constitutes hubris? You know, because, okay, here we are in an extremely complex universe. We have seen over and over and over again the catastrophic consequences of our designs, and we've been ignoring some of the basic tasks. You know, it's like just living where I live, one of the most frustrating things is we're a region that's at incredibly high risk of catastrophic wildfire. And there is dead wood everywhere, you know? And it's like, all you really got to do is pick up the dead wood and burn it. You know, it's like, it's kind of that simple. Basically, take down the dead trees too. That would be good, you know? It would be also great if we would stop taking out the big trees and leaving all the little shit. That's really a bad idea, but that's what they do because that's where the money is. So we really should be doing it the other way around. But on the most basic level, it's like, let's just collect up the dead wood, burn it off, take down the standing dead, get rid of some ladder fuels, and it would change the whole, you know, and some of that work is being done.
So is hubris basically the basic problem with hubris is that it makes us ignore the things which are essential but are, I don't know, boring?
In a way, I think, it's true. I think life is simple, really, when it comes down to it, and that our real job was to take care of this place. You know, instead of having these grand designs and like wanting to build the ultimate Tower of Babel, let's say, you know, it seems like that's kind of the mold. That's the pattern. You know, there are these various projects that human beings get all wrapped up in when really all we got to do is take care of the gift that we were given. But we're in a difficult situation now. You know, we're really out of balance with the natural world, and so it's almost inconceivable for people, like a lot of people who don't have work. It's like, you could go out and pick up some sticks in the woods, but that's it. They don't want to do it. And you can't.
Yeah. No, you got to go to the grocery store, then you got to come home and make dinner, and you got to take care of the baby. And then your wife's like, hey, you're not paying any attention to me. And you don't even have time to do your own, you know, pay any attention to yourself. Like, just relax. So who's going to go out and fucking pick up wood?
I think that, you know, there is a interest in rethinking the way that we're managing things, and some people are have a far more holistic frame that they're trying to incorporate into the actions that we take. And I think that forestry practices are starting to be like that. There is this kind of, and we're actually seeing some pushback too, because one of the things that they've wanted to do is to allow things to burn, because there is kind of a natural fire pattern. And if we had allowed things to burn through certain areas, particularly out in the forested lands, then we wouldn't have the accumulation of the underbrush. But now people are really upset because there's so much smoke during fire season. So now they're trying to like go back to full fire suppression action. And it's a tricky situation, you know? It's like once things really get out of balance, the correction is not simple. So, and it is really terrible in the smoke, you know, in the fire seasons where things really burn a lot and they let them burn, the smoke is, it's like, you feel like you're living in a post-apocalyptic movie. So.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Where we had that problem up where I live too, right? It seems like the inherent problem in this situation, though, is just that the humans choose to live in places where this is a problem. And just like rising sea levels, which is a totally natural thing to happen over time, the rising and lowering of the ocean, like the problem is not that happens. The problem is that we choose to live on the coast, and we get so invested in cities which are on the coast that if like Seattle were to drown, the entire economy of the world would probably feel it, very drastically. So really the problem is that we've built this castle on sand.
Right. Well, that's the whole thing, is that the physical frame is a castle on sand. That's the nature of physical objects, of structures. Structures.
Well, ultimately, but within the context of humanity, there is a better situation. I mean, if you're talking about hunter-gatherers who could probably survive any cataclysm, and are probably the only reason humanity is still here, because they're the only people who could have survived a cataclysm, they're just wandering around and adapting to the environment as it goes. And the physical environment is still very temporary, but it's in that situation, humanity is much less temporary than if we were, if 100% of us were all Seattleites, basically, just totally dependent on the system.
Well, I'm not sure that I understood what you just said there. Could you say that again differently?
Well, I feel like I gave the example of that basically our current civilization is built on sand. The oceans will go up, they'll go down. There's places where there's fires. We have big cities there, and we have to do all this weird, unnatural stuff to try and save ourselves. And then I said, so it's, it's temporary. And you're like, well, yeah, but the physical environment is temporary. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. That's inherently true. But there is a difference between the people who live in cities and humans who are able to, hunter-gatherers who live in the environment. They can move around. They can do whatever they need to adapt to the environment. So I just wanted to keep you from going to the extreme and saying the environment is temporary. Yes, that's true, but there still is a difference between these two modes of humans living.
That's really interesting. I think there's something in there that we need to tease out of it. When a species is in a relative balance with its environment, its need to modify it is less. And as environmental pressures come to bear, the effort on the part of the species to secure its place is going to increase. So you could say that's reflected in the story of the fall from the Garden of Eden, and it's also something that seems to be evident from the kind of pattern of civilization and technology. So you could say that the behavior of the species is to some extent a byproduct of the phase that it's in with respect to the energy requirements that it has, and the phase of that energy depletion. So if you're going to kind of look at his overall thermodynamic model, a species has a certain set of things that it can utilize as an energy source, and in the process of that utilization, it converts it into effluence, which is no longer usable. So on some basic level, there is a trajectory towards crisis. And that trajectory is the crisis is intensified when there is more demand placed upon a dwindling resource.
But it's not necessarily a crisis at all times. It's just a crisis when your effluence has exceeded what the environment can, process, basically. I mean, plants are going to turn our CO2 into oxygen, but if we're putting out too much CO2, then that's not going to happen. And that's when we're on the path to destruction.
Well, you could say what it is that once you realize the situation, those people who are tapped into the various metrics that allow them to see the relationship between the species and the resource, then it's a looming crisis that's ever present, even as things are kind of humming along undisturbed. And then eventually what happens is that you have segments that are eventually pushed into the crisis zone. And you could say that that's basically what's happening around the world right now, that more and more populations are being pushed ever further into the crisis zone. So in that model, that way of looking at it, you could say that the behaviors are in essence driven by that inexorable fact of the conversion of energy from a usable to unusable state, depending upon how the species is set up. And then what seems to happen is that you get a basis for another cycle. So whatever the effluence is becomes sort of the raw material for the next generation of species. And that's why you have these extinction events type of thing. You know, so in deep geological history on the planet, we've had a number of mass extinction events, and it's probably for reasons something along those lines. So I would say that most of the things that we're doing are reactions to these very, very large cycles that we're kind of caught within, whether we recognize them or not. And that the busyness, the business, the intensity of activity necessary in order to maintain some of these things gets to the point where it's extremely difficult to start to contemplate a prenatal spiritual point of view.
Yeah.
That the involvement in the activity to chop wood and carry water is overwhelming and blocks out the light, you could say. Mm-hmm. And that's materialism. You know, that's the absolute conviction that the only thing that's real is the physical frame, and that we have to do whatever we can to preserve it, even though those who study the behavior of the material know full well that you cannot preserve it. It's continually transforming into something else. And that something else is typically relatively alien to what it was that you thought you were trying to preserve when you were busily chopping wood and carrying water. Or chopping water and carrying wood. I think both of those are also important tasks.
Oh, man. How did we get here from free will?
I don't know, but I feel like we're still just scratching the surface on some level, that this is really an incredibly fruitful way of discussing a lot of different things. And it comes down again to, well, okay, here we are in this situation. What is the choice that we're going to make about how we're going to live? You know, a lot of it has to do with the frame, the way that we see things. So conceptual frame is extremely important in determining the behavior that will then influence the physical frame. And that, I think, is the subject of the conversation. It's always a question of how can we see things as clearly as possible, and what does it suggest that we end up doing with our time and energy? And I'm not saying that I know the answer to those questions at all. I really don't. I just think that at least the first step is to try to see things as clearly as possible. And that's why I think these conversations are really worthwhile, and this podcast is still worth doing.
I think so, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I grew up thinking about stuff like this and always thinking, well, the world will be fine because people can always think on this level and talk about these things. And, it's always kind of disappointing to find that almost no one either wants to talk about these things or is even capable of talking about these things. I guess capable could just mean interested or not, but
well, it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah, it's actually reassuring. It does take a lot of effort, but it's enjoyable effort. It's like playing tennis. Tennis takes effort, but it's enjoyable. And this actually, I think this is really important, and I wish that more people are having conversations like this. And so, I mean, you're one of the few people in my life who I feel like can come even remotely close to having a conversation like this. And so I really appreciate it. And I'm really happy that you're doing this podcast.
Well, thank you. I feel exactly the same way. I feel really fortunate to have found you and the handful of others who are willing to come onto the podcast and talk about this kind of stuff with me. And so let's continue to do it.
Thanks for listening. We look forward to serving you again soon. In the meantime, remember, turn that thing over a few times before you pick it up and take it home.